You've probably heard of Rameses the Great, but today I'm going to talk about things about Ramses that you probably haven't heard. Plus, I'm going to talk about the technology, the ancient technology, that I think made him so great. Hi, I'm Lizzie Karen, and welcome to A Prior World, where we question the accepted historical narrative and try to put together the puzzle pieces of humanity's past. So let's start with something most people don't talk about. Ramses the Great was a redhead. Moreover, he was actually a ginger. Even the people of his time didn't know this because a pharaoh's hair is always covered. All the crowns outline the hairline to ensure the hair is never seen. It is my belief that in Egypt, hair was considered not only very private, but also a vulnerability. If someone were to get a piece of your hair, they could use it for magic against you. Although that is a very interesting snippet for an Egyptological conversation, there is so much more to the secrets of Ramses the Great than just his hair. The fact that he became the longest-lived pharaoh, the family history of having Set as their primary deity, essentially the bad guy, and how Ramses achieved his legendary status. So settle in as we journey back in time to a prior world. When we look at the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, one figure clearly stands out like a colossus against the sands of time: Rameses II, known as Ramses the Great. But here's what should make us pause. While most pharaohs ruled for 10 to 20 years, Ramses reigned for an unprecedented 66 years, living into his 90s in an era when the average lifespan was barely 30. The mainstream narrative tells us this was simply good genetics and a particularly healthy lifestyle for a pharaoh. However, Ramses' father and grandfather only lived into their 50s, which for the time was still pretty good. Ramses lived a full 30 years longer. Now that is truly astonishing for the time. And when we dig deeper, we find a rather interesting collection of little anomalies that suggests something far more intriguing may have been going on. Let's look into his background. Born into royalty as the grandson of Ramses I and son of Seti I, Ramses watched both his grandfather and then his father rule over Egypt. He watched and he learned. He became pharaoh at around the age of 25 and immediately set about building on his father's and grandfather's legacy, establishing Egypt as the dominant power in the ancient world. So let's talk about his grandfather. Originally called Rameses, Ramses I was only of noble birth, not of royal birth. He was born into a military family from the Nile Delta region, perhaps near the former Hyksos capital of Avaris. This will become a relevant fact later when we discuss the new city of Ramses, the great city of Pi Ramses. The history of his family has a few names that seem to keep reappearing in his family, like that of his great-grandfather and that of his father Seti. And he also had a great uncle by the name of Khayyam Waset. But a more famous Khayyam Waset came later during Ramses' reign, and it is he that I am actually writing a book about, but that's another story. So, his grandfather kicked off this newly royal dynasty. The reality was that Ramses I was born not long after Akhenaten's death. Depending on the timeline given, it was either about 20 years or 40 years after Akhenaten. So that tumultuous era was still very fresh in the minds of Egyptians. Even Seti mentioned in one of her books that Seti I felt very strongly about the Amarna period and felt compelled to, quote, make Egypt great again, which of course Ramses followed his lead on. Here is a quote by her describing Akhenaten. She said, "A one-track-minded, authoritarian iconoclast who impaled captives and deported populations." So she didn't think very highly of Akhenaten. What's more, Seti disclosed that she believed she knew the location of Nefertiti's tomb, which hasn't been found yet, but expressed some reluctance to disclose its location. She said in a quote, "It's in a most unlikely place." But because Seti I did not like Akhenaten for his attempt to suppress the true Egyptian gods, she said, "We don't want anything more of this family to be known." Back to Ramses the Great, who is known to have clearly held the same beliefs. The 19th dynasty pharaohs, including Seti I and Ramses, worked to erase Akhenaten's monotheistic reforms and return Egypt to its more traditional polytheistic practices. They systematically destroyed any of Akhenaten's monuments that still existed and removed his name from official records. But of course, Ramses went a bit further than that, and he removed the names of other prior pharaohs as well on items, so he could claim certain buildings and statues, etc., as his own. Not really the done thing, according to Ma'at, which is truth. His reign marked the height of Egypt's expansion and cultural achievements. Hence, he's referred to as Ramses the Great. Other than his amazing statues, Ramses is perhaps most famous for his military campaigns, particularly against the Hittites. The Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC became legend, though it was possibly more of a strategic stalemate than the decisive victory that Ramses claims. But nevertheless, the carvings on the wall were very impressive, and he got to show off his symbolic smiting stand, which was very popular amongst pharaohs. On a nicer note, eventually he negotiated the world's first recorded peace treaty with the Hittites, cementing Egypt's borders and ushering in decades of further prosperity. Ramses the Great had a reign of great prosperity in general, and he had wonderful achievements. Some believe he was the Pharaoh of Exodus, but his reign had no history of the disasters described in the Bible. Not only that, but he died very old and not by drowning. I have a theory on who the real Pharaoh of the Exodus was, but hey, that's for another day. And yes, I do believe the Exodus happened. The secrets of Ramses the Great included longevity, ancient technology, and the god Set. And yes, these seem disparate things, but in my opinion, they are related. Rameses the Great is one of the most famous pharaohs of ancient Egypt. You may even have heard of him as Ozymandias from the poem by Percy Shelley. The poem talks about his fallen statue made of stone, and yes, his statues are very impressive. But his list of building projects are mind-blowing. I guess because he lived into his 90s, reigning for 60-odd years, he had plenty of time to complete such an abundance of building projects, and his era was a period of great abundance for the whole country, so he could afford to splash out a bit, and he certainly did. But I think he also cheated a little bit. First, he usurped a few things from other pharaohs before him, and In my opinion, he also had a little bit of ancient technological assistance. So let's talk about his projects, the buildings and the statues. Our man Ramses wasn't just interested in new projects, though, but also in the restoration of some old sites. And I'm talking really old, like thousands of years before him, from the Old Kingdom. So strangely enough, some of these sites he actually restored, while others of these ancient sites he completely stripped so that he could reuse the stone. How he chose between them is a mystery, but myth tells us that he was also searching the ancient sites to find magic. A quick quote by Arthur C. Clarke is, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." Okay, so I don't do a very good Arthur C. Clarke impersonation, but you get my drift. So in my opinion, he was searching for the tech of the ancient ones, and it didn't just start with him. I believe that many of his predecessor pharaohs had also had similar interests, but Rameses had a head start because of what his father found at the Osirian. Because I'm of the opinion that his father didn't build the Osirian, he found it. So what do we know for sure about his father Seti? Archaeologists say that he built the Osirian. I say he found the Osirian while he was building his temple. So archaeologists believe that it's possible that his temple, not the Osirian, but his temple, was built there because it was the site of an earlier temple. Not the Osirian, as I said. So based on this assumption, it seems that he had access, possibly, to information about an earlier time, maybe even the time of Zep-Tepi. We know this because he carved the king's list onto the walls. We also know that the Osirian is supposed to have healing powers. In my opinion, it certainly does have healing powers. So what else did Seti find, other than the Osirian and a list of pharaohs? I think maybe he found some ancient technology as well. Rameses, when he was a child, his father was building this temple, and so Rameses was quite busy finding his own things to do, and surely any child would spend time swimming in a place seemingly designed for that particular joy, and that is the Osirian of Abydos. So it's not a big jump to realize that this activity may well have contributed to his longevity. I've mentioned this to a few archaeologists I know, and all of them look as if a light's going on in their head and go, "Oh gosh, we'd never thought about that. Yes, that's very interesting." Now, I don't know if they were just being nice to me. It's possible. But I genuinely felt that they agreed with me. Because usually archaeologists, if they don't agree with you, they're quite open about telling you that they don't agree with you. Anyway, what else might he have found? Well, maybe some information about other sites of interest, maybe sites that had other ancient technology. Obviously, we can't be sure of what he found, but we can be sure that Rameses, his son, was extremely focused on ancient sites. Once Rameses had got to a certain stage in his career as a pharaoh, he put one of his sons in charge of looking for ancient sites, restoring ancient sites, and trying to find Egyptian magic. So this exploration, restoration, and discovery, and of course even the dismantling work, was handed over to his favourite son at the time, who was Khayyam Waset. Let us now speculate. What if all this searching was for ancient technology that maybe he got wind of through the Osirian, or maybe something that Khayyam Waset found out when he was the high priest of Ptah, that gave him the feeling that there was things that he could find in certain sites. And hence it would give him access to certain information, certain things that may advance his pharaonic career. So why do I assume technology? Firstly, because of all his achievements, and secondly, how long he reigned, and lastly, because of the myths that surround his favourite son, Khayyam Waset. We have many examples in Egyptian myth and in the religious texts, even like texts from the Bible and the Kebra Nagast, of what was referred to as magic. But our modern world would see this as technology. If Khayyam Waset was in fact looking for ancient technology for his father Rameses the Great, there is an awful lot to choose from. So let's just quickly list out the magic, aka the technology of the ancients that's in myth and religion, just for fun, okay? So we've got energy and other weapons like the Ark of the Covenant. We've got matter transformation like the cornucopia or even water to wine. We've got rod and staff technology, the Jed pillar, the Waz scepter, Moses' rod, Aaron's rod. We've got longevity in the key of life, the flower of life, the tree of life, and many other myths and legends. There's portals and gateways. In fact, in Egypt, they are everywhere. They make these false doors as a portal or gateway for the gods to come and go. There's advanced communication systems in myths, for example, communicating with the gods through statues or in dreams. There's the control of water. Now, this is a really interesting one because both Egypt and the Bible have an almost exact representation, or example, should I say, of water being parted by the use of a rod. And it's described in different context, but the actual what happened, the way the water was parted, is identical. So that's very interesting. Then we have examples of protective forces, protective amulets, cursed tombs, fiery swords. And of course, a big one is divine knowledge, like the wisdom of Thoth, the wisdom of Solomon, or the Hall of Records. Another interesting one is architectural energy, the energy of pyramids, of obelisks. And for another example, a very good one in my opinion, is the Osirians' piezoelectric energy. There are construction myths as well, myths about levitation, myths about Solomon's temple being constructed using a demon's tool, which is intriguing in itself. There's also transportational technology. There's things like wings on gods. There's Ra's solar bark that flies. There's Elijah's ascension in the Bible. There's the flying machine. Now, this is so cool. A flying machine of Solomon, which is described in the Kebra Nagast. And that's how Solomon's son escaped with the Ark of the Covenant. What a great story that is. If you get the chance to read the Kebra Nagast, just do it because it's full of this sort of thing. It's fascinating. Anyway, I deviate. There's things like surveillance, all-seeing divine eyes. There's divine awareness both in Egyptian mythology and in the Bible. There's the precise manufacturing elements. So like there's some amazing pre-dynastic stone vessels. The sacred geometry and mathematics, things that are found in the pyramid and through many of the temples and statues. And we're talking things like pi, before pi was supposed to have been known about. We're talking about the Fibonacci sequence. These are all mathematical things that can be proven. And another example is many myths and legends, there is the power of words, of voice-activated commands, the concept of abracadabra. This is very common in ancient writings. And yeah, there's lots and lots more I could give examples of, but this episode is not about all this, although I'd really be happy to discuss any of these things in more detail in other episodes if people, said they wanted me to make an episode on one specific area. Obviously, I have made a few episodes on ancient technology before, but if there's anything else, just let me know in the comments. But as I said, I have deviated slightly, but I had a purpose in my deviation, and it's just to express how many things there could have been that Rameses was looking for. Now, maybe Rameses was just caught up in the myth and the legend, and he just believed that it was true and went in search of it. Or maybe it is true and he found some of it. Archaeologists would say, oh, it's only myth, like the gods are only myth or symbolism. But my point is that Ramses believed in the ancient magic and was looking for this sort of thing. Well, in my opinion, he was anyway. What did he find? I don't know, but I can guess. So let's now jump to his building achievements, and let's toy with the idea that these two concepts are in fact linked. As a builder, Ramses was unparalleled. At least on record, he was unparalleled. He constructed more temples and monuments than any other pharaoh. It includes the magnificent temples of Abu Simbel, which were carved directly into the rock face. He finished off his father's temple at Karnak. He tweaked the Seti temple in Abydos, and then proceeded to build many structures from scratch. Or that's what we believe anyway. Massive one at Memphis and at Thebes. Oh, and then there was his great city Pi-Ramses. And he had countless statues and inscriptions proclaiming this greatness. Okay, the example that I mentioned of Abu Simbel, it was carved directly into solid rock, and it represents an engineering feat that really challenges our understanding of ancient capabilities. The temple's interior chambers extend 200 feet into the mountain, with precisely carved statues reaching 65 feet in height. But here's where it gets interesting. The temple is aligned so perfectly that twice a year, sunlight penetrates the entire length of the temple to illuminate the inner sanctuary. This requires quite a bit of astronomical knowledge and some engineering precision that supposedly didn't exist in 1250 BC. 1250 BC. So when UNESCO moved Abu Simbel to save it from flooding, it took our modern engineers with computers and lasers and heavy machinery 4 years to disassemble and reconstruct it. So how did ancient workers achieve this level of precision with copper tools, pounding stones and ropes? The size of his ego is demonstrated very effectively at Abu Simbel. And those 4 colossal seated statues of him, so all 4 were of him, were carved into the cliff face. In Upper Egypt, Rameses completed and expanded numerous temples. He finished the great hypostyle hall at Karnak Temple in Luxor, which was begun by his father, Seti I. He added his own decorative elements, of course, and his own inscriptions. He also built extensively in Luxor Temple, adding a pylon, obelisks, and statues. At Abydos, he completed his father's temple and then went on to construct his own nearby temple complex, which was also quite big. Rameses founded an entirely new capital city called Pi-Ramses in the Nile Delta, which served as his primary residence and his administrative center. This massive urban project included palaces, temples, military installations, factories, yes, factories, and residential quarters for thousands of inhabitants. In Memphis, the ancient capital, he erected numerous statues and monuments, including a colossal statue that once stood over 30 feet tall, which you can still see in Memphis at one of the museums. He built temples throughout Middle Egypt and in the Delta region, often incorporating earlier structures while adding his own distinctive architectural elements. His building program extended deep into Nubia, where he constructed temples at Bayt el-Wali, Girth Hussein, Wadi es-Sabua, Dakar, and Maharaka. These served both religious purposes and as symbols of Egyptian power in the conquered territories. Throughout Egypt, Ramses erected countless obelisks, statues, stelae, proclaiming his achievements. Many existing temples received additions, renovations, or a new decorative program during his reign. His building projects employed thousands of workers and consumed enormous resources, but they succeeded in creating lasting monuments to his power, monuments that have endured for over 3 millennia. Ramses erected more colossal statues of himself than any other pharaoh, and some of those statues, as I said, they've got his cartouche on them, but not really his face. But the smallest repair of a sanctuary was sufficient excuse for him to have his name inscribed on every prominent part of the structure. And when Ramses inscribed, he did it with depth, and I mean depth. This is how his inscriptions looked. They were carved so deep into the stone and with incredible precision that the next pharaoh could not possibly inscribe over them. It just wouldn't have been feasible. And this practice was expensive. He would take existing statues, obelisks, and temples from previous pharaohs and simply carve his own royal cartouche over the original inscriptions, effectively claiming credit for their construction. And it wasn't just limited to adding his name. In some cases, he would modify the physical features of statues to try to better resemble him. And it also explains why some of the statues look less like him than others. Ramses founded an entirely new capital city called Pi-Ramses in the Nile Delta, which served as his primary residence and his administrative center. This massive urban project included palaces, temples, military installations, factories, and residential quarters for thousands of inhabitants. But I didn't mention the prior Hyksos city of Avaris that sat nearby. Why is this important? The Hyksos were the Asiatic invaders that took over Lower Egypt and became the pharaohs of the 15th dynasty. So I think the location had something to do with that. The link is not yet completely clear, but it does seem to explain the Rameses family association to the god Set, who was the chosen god of the Hyksos people. I also believe the Hyksos history is somehow linked to the biblical story of Joseph and then much later to Moses, but that's a story for another time. As for the god Set, who is perceived generally as a bad guy, is also the protector of Ra's solar bark. He fights off the serpent Apophis, the true embodiment of chaos and evil, and he does that every night. So Set was seen as Ra's defender against the forces that threaten cosmic order, hence the name of family members of Rameses the Great had the name Ra or Set within them. The origins of the cult of Set in the Ramesside period is rather left field in my opinion, and here's why. During the Second Intermediate Period, which is circa 1650 to 1550 BC, a group of these Near Eastern peoples, known as the Hyksos, possibly Semitic in origin. Oh, by the way, the name Hyksos seems to mean something along the lines of rulers from foreign lands. Anyway, they took over Lower Egypt. They didn't invade or anything. They did it quite slowly, immigration and various things. And over a little while, they found that they ruled the Nile Delta, and that was the area around Avaris right through to the Mediterranean. Anyway, they adopted many of the ways of the Egyptians, and they chose Set. He was originally an Upper Egypt god, but he was the most similar one to the god of their origins, who was a storm god. And the Hyksos are recorded as worshipping essentially just the one god at some stages. In particular, one of the pharaohs chose him as his only god. And I do find that rather interesting. And by the way, it was the Hyksos that introduced the horse and chariot into Egypt. And it's not like they conquered it. They conquered the area. They just appeared and took over. They slowly assimilated themselves into Egypt over time. Actually, does that sound familiar at all? Anyway, when Ahmose I overthrew the Hyksos leader and then expelled some of the people, that would be in about 1522 BC, the Egyptians' treatment of any remaining foreigners was not really very good. And it's surprising that the Set cult of the Hyksos, it survived in Avaris, and even the pharaoh Ahmose was in the priesthood of Set. So the Set cult definitely continued. Within 200 years of the expulsion of the Hyksos rulers came the weird and even wonderful in some ways Amarna period. This was the time of Akhenaten and his one god policy, somewhat reminiscent of the Hyksos rulers who favoured one god Set, but Akhenaten took it to extremes, and he really annoyed the priesthood. So within 50 years of the disgrace of Akhenaten for having annoyed the priesthood so much, there rose another era, the era of the New Kingdom, and with it came the 19th dynasty and the Ramesside dynasty, and of course Rameses the Great. I think he was the third pharaoh in that time frame. So this context actually makes the history and the mystery around Ramesses even more interesting to me, as it relates to the religion, because the pharaohs of this era really hated anything to do with the Amarna period. And this one god, Aten, was really not ever in favour again. And they attempted to wipe every trace of that time frame off the face of Egypt. So the 19th dynasty, embrace of Set, was somewhat surprising, in my opinion, considering Set had also been a chosen god of the Hyksos and at one time was the god of their one god policy. Nevertheless, this relatively unusual choice by the Ramesside pharaohs is interesting, but their Egyptian royal tradition was more inclusive, at least, as they supported the other gods too. But Set and Ra were their favourites, making Rameses II, i.e. Rameses the Great, his devotion was particularly notable. So, As an aside, in Egypt, red hair, like that of Ramses, was associated with Set. And Ramses' father, Seti I, whose name obviously has the god's name within it, his name means follower of Set, which also may hint at a family trait of red hair. Set was a god of chaos, storms, warfare. These are attributes that aligned well with Rameses the Great, because he liked that image of him as a great military pharaoh. Not much of a god of fertility, Set, though, and that's surprising considering Ramses is reputed to have fathered over 100 children with his many wives, including his beloved Nefertari. His longevity was not seemingly passed down to his kids, as he outlived most of his sons, and the throne eventually passed to his 13th son, Merenptah. And that's when Ramses died in his 90s. So Merenptah actually is a very interesting topic in his own right, but hey, that's for another day. The mummy of Rameses the Great was discovered in 1881, and it revealed more than just his great age. It also revealed much of his physicality, like he was tall, red-haired. He still had his own teeth, but they were in absolutely terrible condition, but at least he still had them. But it would also seem that he was vain, even dyeing his hair, which originally was red and had turned white, but he dyed it with henna. And it makes you think, why would a 90-year-old man be so concerned with his appearance? And who would see his hair anyway, except maybe his queens and his children? More puzzling still, while on the subject of his mummy, X-rays revealed that Ramses had suffered numerous injuries throughout his life, in particular wounds and fractures, yet he survived them all and continued to rule actively until his death, eventually dying of old age. In fact, I think he had more said festivals showing his strength than any other pharaoh. Another quick aside, about his mummy. In the 1970s, it was flown to Paris for advanced scientific study, and it was also to undergo a bit of extra preservation. And in order for it to go to Paris, it needed to have a passport. So here's a picture of the passport. So is that cool or what? Anyway, back on topic. So what made Ramses so special? Well, there's an aspect to this story which is a bit annoying because it's partly religion and it's partly his gigantic ego. So Ramses was very keen to maintain the old ways, but he didn't just maintain them, he actually upped the ante, and he transformed Egyptian religion a little bit more. Not like Akhenaten, but yeah, still a bit, he did some changes. He, in fact, elevated himself to a divine status during his lifetime. And this is something previously reserved only for deceased pharaohs. You had to be dead before you could be recognized in this way. So his temples don't just honor the gods. They placed Ramses as an equal among them, as a god. And previous pharaohs, as I said, had only gone as far as becoming gods or being with the gods after death. And, okay, some of them claimed to be the offspring of a god or the only one who could commune with a specific god, but Ramses most certainly took it one step further. It's clear from visiting his temples that he associated knowledge with the gods, and he really did want to get as much knowledge as he possibly could, and in fact even preserve ancient knowledge. The walls of his temples contained detailed astronomical charts, mathematical formulas, and what appear to be technical diagrams that some mainstream archaeologists dismiss as just religious symbolism. In fact, it is his father's temple in Abydos, the Seti temple, that he actually finished after his father passed away, and which has some very strange glyphs that look like very modern equipment, like submarine and helicopter, etc. Intriguing, yes, but apparently it's just that one lot of hieroglyphs was put on top of another lot, and then bits fell off so that you got to see both. And strangely enough, this does make sense. But the funny thing is that one Egyptologist that I spoke to said that in Egypt there are no accidents. Things don't happen accidentally on the walls of temples. So, yeah, don't really know what to make of that. But when you see them, which I'm putting up now, you'll see why so many people see helicopters and submarines on that wall. But even if you don't think the helicopter glyphs are suspicious, there are other hints at lost knowledge. Recent researchers have revealed that the Ramses architects and the craftspeople possessed knowledge that was supposedly too much for that time. They understood advanced mathematics, astronomy, and engineering principles that wouldn't be rediscovered until at least the Renaissance. The precision of his statues suggests tools and techniques that do not appear in the archaeological record. It boggles the mind that copper chisels could have done the work that you see. Author Christopher Dunn has spoken out and has been very clear regarding the precision of the Ramses statues. Dunn himself is a manufacturing engineer with specific experience in precision engineering, and he analyzed the precision of the ancient Egyptian artifacts, specifically the colossal statues of Ramses II, and Dunn considered them flawless, with perfect symmetry that could not, in his personal opinion, be the result of freehand carving with copper chisels. Some of the most stunning observations were mirror image symmetry, i.e. the left and right sides of the Ramses statue faces are precise mirror images of each other, suggesting a level of design and manufacturing control far above what should have been possible. Furthermore, he suggested that the ancient Egyptians used advanced geometric principles such as Pythagorean triangles, Fibonacci spirals, and the golden ratio. Many of Ramses' most impressive achievements seem to have been quietly downplayed by modern archaeology. Why? Perhaps because acknowledging the full scope of his achievements would require us to completely revise our understanding of ancient capabilities. And that's something the archaeological establishment seem reluctant to do. If Rameses the Great possessed knowledge, technology, or even longevity that we don't understand, what does that say about our view of the past? Were the ancient Egyptians more advanced in certain aspects than we've been taught? The evidence suggests that Ramses wasn't just a successful pharaoh. He was a bit of an anomaly, and that he challenges everything we think we know about ancient Egypt. But wait, there's more. Let's talk about the tombs. We've talked about him specifically, but this is quite a biggie. The tomb of Ramses is KV7, but there's another tomb with his name on it. The tomb of the sons of Ramses, called KV5. And in my opinion, it is the most mysterious and most incredible and unbelievable of all the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. and it's one we are not allowed to visit. Rameses II, Rameses the Great's tomb, in the Valley of the Kings in itself is fascinating. But unfortunately, it was damaged in flash floods. It's a pretty large tomb. There's plenty of video footage of it. 3 sloping corridors leading to a well and a pillared chamber with 2 side chambers, a central descent and 2 corridors which lead to another chamber. And in this chamber, there's a strange change of axis. So, and it leads to the then burial chamber and its 6 adjacent side chambers. Although heavily looted, the decorations are interesting and consist of scenes from the Book of Gates, Book of the Dead, the Book of the Heavenly Cow, the Litany of Ra, and the opening of the mouth ritual. But his official tomb is not where his body was found. It was in a separate royal cache discovered in 1881, which is now on display in the National Museum of Ancient Civilization. As fascinating and fabulous as his tomb was, it pales into insignificance when we compare it to the second tomb that bears his name. And I'm talking about the tomb that archaeologists say was created for his many sons. Now, I can't really begin to explain this tomb. I just don't have the words. So let's just watch a 3D rendering of it. And after seeing this structure, if you still think he created this just as a tomb for his sons, then I have no words left. The story of Rameses the Great, whether history or myth, is fascinating. Rameses was even called the Great Ancestor by successive pharaohs. He is considered, incorrectly I should add, in my opinion, to be the pharaoh of the Exodus. But since he didn't die of drowning, it seems pretty obvious to me that it wasn't him. But that's a whole other episode that I will do at some stage, where I'll explain to you my perspective on the Exodus. The story of Rameses the Great is a fabulous snapshot into the past of humanity, and it makes perfect sense if there are Egyptologists that don't agree with it. But when you really think about it, it's odd. At least, the very least, it's odd. His unprecedented longevity, the impossible architectural achievements, mysterious vitality right into his 90s. It suggests that he may have had capabilities that we've only just begun to understand in our modern world. And he may not even have fully understood it either. In a nutshell, this is what I believe. I believe Seti I, his father, found information and technology when he discovered the Osirian. As a child, Rameses swam in the Osirian, which helped him to recover from any injuries or illnesses he had through his life, and enabled him to remain strong even in his old age. It could not give him impossibly long life, as described in the Bible, but it most certainly kept him strong. It couldn't prevent the aging process and the deterioration of his teeth, so eventually he succumbed to old age. I believe that the information and technology that Seti I found at the site of the Osirian enabled Rameses to engage in massive building projects, to achieve incredible accuracy, and to provide clues as to where other interesting artifacts from the Old Kingdom and before might be found. In my opinion, the Old Kingdom pharaohs themselves also had found these things from the ruins of an earlier civilization. And this creates a picture of Ramses, which is even more fascinating than he is described in the history books. And I simply don't have words to tell you how interesting I find this pharaoh. But it is his position in history, i.e. what came before him, that in my opinion put Ramses on the path of searching for older sites. And I'm talking much older, 2,000 years before him. It's clear in the mythology that surrounds his fourth and favourite son what he was after. So Khayyam-Waset, who was his fourth son, he climbed the ranks of the priests of Ptah until reaching the position of high priest. And then, once in that position, he had access to all the ancient secrets of the temple. So I think that this was part of the plan. And in gaining this position, he then went about doing as his father instructed, Rameses the Great, in going to these sites and looking for things and restoring some places and demolishing others in the name of restoration and in the name of using the ruins to build other sites. So, okay, they did some archaeological work. There are some sites today that wouldn't be there if it wasn't for Rameses and Khayyam-Waset doing the restoration. But there's also a lot of places that maybe they just thought it was too badly ruined and just decided to reuse all the stone. Or maybe they were searching so thoroughly that in the search they ruined the site so badly it was irrecoverable. This we will never know. But I'll leave you with that thought because, in my opinion, the myths around Khayyam-Waset and his father are very well worth investigating. And I have done an episode on this, which I'll put a link in the description, because that pulls all the pieces together of Ramses' life, in my opinion. I'm Lizzie Karen, and I think that the truth isn't always what we've been taught in the history books. Sometimes we need to dig deeper, question the narrative given to us, and piece together the puzzle that I call a prior world. And thanks for still being here. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, feel free to hit the like bucket. Feel free to hit the like button and even subscribe. I still have lots more episodes planned.